In 1954, hundreds of CIA agents risked their lives digging a secret tunnel under Berlin to spy on the Soviets. For 11 months, they recorded 443,000 enemy communications. They thought they'd pulled off the greatest intelligence coup in history. They were wrong. One man had betrayed them from the very beginning, and the truth of what really happened wouldn't surface for 30 years. Bill Harvey was the kind of CIA officer who carried a loaded pistol at his desk. Chain smoking, heavy drinking, and absolutely obsessed with beating the KGB, he walked into a classified briefing in 1953 with an idea so dangerous it bordered on insane. He wanted to dig a tunnel from West Berlin into Soviet-controlled East Berlin and tap directly into the Red Army's underground communication cables. Not just listen from a distance, actually break into enemy territory, underground, and physically attach recording devices to their most secure military lines. His superiors thought he was crazy. Berlin was the most heavily militarized city on Earth, crawling with Soviet soldiers and KGB agents. The border was watched 24 hours a day. One mistake, one sound, one suspicious movement, and the operation would trigger an international crisis that could start World War III. But Harvey had done his homework. British intelligence had discovered something extraordinary. The Soviets had buried their main communication cables just 18 inches below the surface in East Berlin. They were so confident in their security that they'd made themselves vulnerable. Harvey partnered with MI6, and together they began planning Operation Gold. The tunnel would stretch 1,476 feet, nearly 5 football fields, burrowing 20 feet underground to avoid detection. It would be the longest covered tunnel ever constructed. They purchased a warehouse in the American sector, right near the border, and built a fake radar station on top to explain all the activity and security. Then, in September 1954, the digging began. The work was absolutely brutal. 3 teams of engineers worked 8-hour shifts, 7 days a week, clawing through clay and soil in a space so cramped they could barely move. The temperature underground reached sweltering levels. Men worked shirtless, drenched in sweat, breathing stale air that had to be pumped in from above. Every shovel of dirt had to be removed silently. They used sandbags to muffle sounds, terrified that Soviet listening posts would detect the vibration. The tunnel had to maintain perfect alignment, no deviation, or they'd miss the cable junction entirely. There were no second chances. Then 3 months into the dig, disaster nearly struck. A worker's pickaxe hit a metal plate, and the sound rang out like a bell through the tunnel. Everyone froze. For 45 seconds, nobody breathed. They listened for footsteps above, for shouting, for the sound of Soviet soldiers responding to the noise. Nothing came, but one engineer later recalled, "In that moment, every single one of us was certain we were about to be captured. You could see it in everyone's eyes. We'd just signed our own death warrants." The fear never left. East German border guards patrolled mere feet above their heads. If discovered, there would be no escape, no rescue. They'd be captured, interrogated, possibly executed as spies. But they kept digging. For 11 months, they'd moved 6,000 tons of soil, reinforced the tunnel with steel supports, installed lighting and ventilation, and laid cable for the sophisticated recording equipment that would capture Soviet communications. In February 1955, they broke through into East Berlin. They had reached the target. Now came the most terrifying phase. British technician Peter Lunn led a team that had to physically expose the Soviet cables and install taps without triggering any alarms. The cables carried constant electrical signals. Any interruption, and Soviet engineers would know something was wrong. Working in near darkness, wearing gloves to avoid fingerprints, they carefully excavated around the cables. Days of painstaking work. One wrong cut and the mission was over. Finally, they installed the taps. sophisticated devices that could intercept 500 telephone channels simultaneously without detection. On May 11, 1955, the tunnel went operational. The intelligence flooded in immediately. Soviet generals discussing troop movements, political officers debating strategy, engineers revealing weapon specifications, diplomats gossiping about Kremlin power struggles. 350 personnel worked rotating shifts, monitoring conversations around the clock. 50,000 reels of tape, 443,000 conversations, 6 tons of transcripts translated from Russian and German. CIA leadership was ecstatic. They believed they'd achieved the impossible, a direct window into Soviet military command during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. They had no idea they were listening to a performance. George Blake sat in the planning meetings for Operation Gold, taking notes, asking questions, helping coordinate between American and British intelligence. He was trusted, experienced, a rising star in MI6. He was also a Soviet spy. Blake had been recruited by the KGB years earlier during the Korean War, after being captured and subjected to ideological conditioning that turned him against the West. By the time Operation Gold began, he'd been passing secrets to Moscow for years, and he told them everything about the tunnel. The location, the construction schedule, the technical specifications, even the types of communications they'd be monitoring. The KGB knew about the operation before the first shovel broke ground. But here's where the story becomes truly twisted. The Soviets didn't shut down the tunnel. They let it operate for nearly a year, knowing the Americans and British were listening to their communications. Why? Because exposing the tunnel would reveal they had a mole inside British intelligence, someone with access to the operation's deepest secrets. George Blake was feeding them information worth far more than any single wiretap. They couldn't risk losing him. So the KGB made a devil's bargain. They'd sacrifice some real intelligence to maintain Blake's cover, but they'd carefully control what passed through those tapped cables. Sensitive communications were rerouted through different channels. Important conversations were staged to include misleading information. The Americans and British were getting intelligence, but it was intelligence the Soviets wanted them to have. The tunnel became a double game where nobody knew who was really winning. On April 21, 1956, a team of Soviet and East German soldiers accidentally discovered the tunnel during routine cable maintenance. Within hours, the site was swarming with troops, journalists, and diplomats. The Soviets made a propaganda spectacle of it. They gave tours, showing off American equipment and condemning Western espionage. Photos of the tunnel appeared in newspapers worldwide. The CIA was publicly humiliated. But privately, American intelligence officials celebrated. They believed the operation had been a massive success, providing invaluable insights into Soviet military capabilities. The 11 months of recordings were being analyzed, translated, and integrated into strategic planning. To them, the tunnel was worth every risk. Neither side revealed the full truth. The Americans didn't know they'd been compromised from day one. The Soviets didn't reveal they'd known all along, because that would expose their spy. And George Blake continued his work for MI6, passing secrets to Moscow, watching as the Americans congratulated themselves on an operation he'd betrayed before it even began. For 5 more years, Blake operated undetected. He attended meetings, read classified reports, and sent everything to his KGB handlers. The damage he caused was incalculable, compromising dozens of operations and exposing hundreds of Western agents. Then, in 1961, a Polish intelligence officer named Michael Goleniewski defected to the West. In his debriefing, he mentioned a Soviet spy inside British intelligence. The clues pointed to Blake. When confronted, Blake confessed to everything. The tunnel, the operations he'd betrayed, the agents whose lives he'd endangered. British authorities were stunned. One of their most trusted officers had been working for Moscow for nearly a decade. Blake was tried in secret and sentenced to 42 years in prison, the longest sentence ever imposed by a British court at that time. 3 years for each agent he was believed to have compromised. But in 1966, Blake escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison with help from anti-establishment activists. He fled across Europe in the back of a camper van and eventually reached Moscow, where he was welcomed as a hero. He lived there for the rest of his life, giving occasional interviews, writing his memoirs, and receiving Soviet honors. He never expressed remorse. When asked about the agents who died because of his betrayal, he said they were casualties of war. Blake died in Moscow in 2020 at age 98, having outlived most of the people he betrayed.